So Esther chapter 4 is probably the most popular chapter out of Esther. In fact, if you're somebody who has been to a sermon series on the book of Esther, they pull out chapter 4, they quote this one verse, and perhaps, the verse is, "And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." And it's the most famous verse in all of Esther. And so one that I've been looking forward to preaching on, just because it is the verse that people remember out of this book, right? A lot of people don't know about the rest of the book, but they do know that one verse, right? Perhaps it was just for this moment that you were here. And when I came to this text, Esther chapter 4, I started thinking about defining moments. Everybody has defining moments. Sometimes they're planned out and purposeful, like which college are you going to go to? That defining moment when you said that you wanted to marry somebody, or somebody proposed to you and you said yes, or maybe you said no, and that was a different kind of defining moment, but it shaped the trajectory of the rest of your life, right? For me, a defining moment was when I showed up to First Christian Church, right? It was a true defining moment for me. We had gone to other churches, and we showed up here, and my wife pulled me the whole way. I was kicking and screaming, didn't want to go. But I did show up, and because we started attending First Christian Church, it shaped the trajectory of my life. I did other things, and I would have probably never done otherwise, right? That is a defining moment. It's reshaped. And like I said, some are very planned out. Which college are you going to? Who are you going to marry? Like those big moments that you think about for a long time. And then other kinds of defining moments are those defining moments or those crossroads that come upon you unexpectedly. You weren't ready for them at all, but having that chance encounter reshape the direction of your life. Like with a friend that maybe you meet at the gym who becomes a lifelong friend, right? You had no plan on running into him, or something like that. There's also, real sad or like defining moments. Somebody could die unexpectedly, like Esther's parents. That was a defining moment for her. It reshaped the trajectory of her life, and it wasn't something that she had a lot of choice in. Esther chapter 4 is about a defining moment that takes this person, Hadassah or Esther, however you want to say her name, and changes her from who she was, somebody who's more of a victim, described as taken, and to be somebody who stands up and takes responsibility for her own life and the life of other people. So she encounters a defining moment. And that's really where we're going with this. I want to go through the chapter just real quick. This is Esther chapter 4, and we're just going to go through the whole thing, right? So we're right there, Esther chapter 4. And what we find out is after everything that happened in chapter 3, all the Haman's hatred, which, by the way, who's glad we don't have any noisemakers? Right? All of Haman's hatred, right? That led through chapter 3, how he spread his hatred throughout the empire. Well, now Mordecai finds out about it, right? That's verse 1 of chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, he learned about Haman. He learned that he was not content with just punishing him for not bowing down, but he wanted to kill, destroy all Jews, men, women, and children, because he had a generational hatred for these people, right? They have family ties that just didn't fit. He wants to kill them all. So he goes to the king, and he asks the king for permission. Of course, he has a veiled agenda, spreads a half-truth, tells the king what he should think, and then convinces the king to just hand over the signet ring. And an edict goes out the day before Passover that all Jews are going to be annihilated. Mordecai finds out about this, and he tears his clothes, right? I love the way that the Hebrew people or the Jews will show their sorrow. It's very public, right? I mean, listen to what he says. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. Right? Could you imagine somebody doing that today, by the way? Like, you have this really unfortunate, sorrowful life event, and so you just rip your shirt, right? Just tear all your clothes. And sackcloth is a type of coarse hair, like goat's hair or camel's hair, that they would wear, and it would cause you to itch. That would be something we wouldn't do in our society either, right? Like, I'm already feeling bad on the inside. I need to double this by making myself feel bad on the outside. Put on something that itches. My grandma's cotton sweater, something like that, right? And so he puts on sackcloth and ashes on his head, and he's showing outwardly how he's feeling inwardly. And he goes into the streets and he wails, right? It's not like this suffer in silence mentality. The Jews don't have that. They go out and they wail through the streets because they heard of what was going to be done. And all the people, according to verse 3, in every province to which the edict went and the order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes, right? It's a time of sadness, desperation. What are we going to do? Maybe you might even say hopelessness, right? This is a defining moment for some people. Their life is now in jeopardy. Within the next 11 months, they're going to be put to death. What are they going to do? But see, Mordecai goes through the streets wailing, but he can't go to the citadel itself because the king has a rule that no one who is wearing sackcloth and ashes or mourning can go into the citadel where the king is or where Esther is. And he needs somebody on the inside. Because in order for him to do anything about this circumstance, he's got to have somebody on the inside close to the king where the edict actually came from, right? And he can't do that as long as he's wearing his weeping apparel. So he goes as close as he can to the gate. And from there, Esther finds out that her cousin Mordecai is out there making a spectacle of himself. He's dressed in sackcloth and ashes, and he's wailing at the gate. And so Esther does, in the next scene, Esther does what I think any cousin who cared about her cousin would do, right? She sent him a change of clothes. Like, whatever you got going on here with the sackcloth and ashes, you need to buck up. You need to put some new clothes on. It says, the text, that Esther was in great distress, right, because of Mordecai. Now, she's not in distress because of the edict, because she doesn't even know about the edict yet. She's in distress because somebody that she cares about, her cousin, is publicly mourning, and she knows just the way that he's doing it points to the gravity of the situation. Something bad has happened. And so she sends out her servant to find out, right? To take clothes to Mordecai. And of course, if Mordecai would have put on the clothes, he could have come closer to the citadel, where maybe he could have had easier access to talking to Esther, but he refuses. He's not going to put on the clothes because he is not weeping privately. He's publicly proclaiming his sorrow. He wants the world around him, through his wailing, to know that something is wrong. So he refuses to put on the clothes that Esther sent. So Esther had to go back to Mordecai, right? This is verse 9. This is verse 6. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of the money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai began to tell Esther, or Esther's servant, Hathach, everything, right? Which is kind of odd because you notice that he even knew the exact amount of money. Like, how did he get this information? Right? It seems very likely that Mordecai might have had somebody on the inside. That's how he found out about the plot to kill the king in the first place. But now he knows even how much money the king was bribed in order to do this. Mordecai tells Esther everything. And then he says this to her. It's kind of a challenge. It's kind of a crossroads, a life-defining moment. He says to her in verse 8, it says he gave him a copy of the text of the edict for the annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and to explain to her. And he told him to instruct her to go to the king's presence and beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Right? Like, that is his instruction to her. Throughout the whole text, all the 3 chapters that we've gone through so far, Esther's obedience to Mordecai has been emphasized, right? She continues to hide herself, or her identity as a Jew, because she was being obedient to Mordecai. And now Mordecai is giving her another instruction. He wants her to go to the king and plead for her people. That's a crossroad moment. Is she going to do it? Esther sends back this reply in verse 11. All the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned to the king has but one law, and that they be put to death unless the king extends his golden scepter to them and spares their life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. She tells Mordecai something that he would have already known, right? Esther can't just approach the king. Anybody who approaches the king is going to have their life in jeopardy, right? unless the king extends his scepter. So first of all, it's very dangerous for her to do this. And also, she's not so sure if it's going to work. You guys who are married, is it a good marriage when you don't see your spouse for 30 days? No. So well, some of you may think it's like a vacation, right? But I promise you, if you hadn't seen your spouse for 30 days, you would wonder if everything's all okay in that relationship. See, I think Esther was feeling that. She's unsure that if she shows up to the king, that maybe he'll even extend the scepter because she hasn't seen him for 30 days. Maybe she is not in the favor of the king anymore. What I'm saying is that it was a scary situation for her. She's basically refusing to do it. Like, she's saying, don't you know? Like, and coming up with reasons or excuses why she may not do the thing that maybe God would want her to do, right? But Mordecai comes back to her with this in verse 13. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance from the Jews or for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows, this is the famous verse, and who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. See, Mordecai gives her three things to consider, right? As he sends back his reply, three things to consider. First, she's a Jew. And if she doesn't, she's not going to escape. The edict says all Jews, men, women, and children. And perhaps Mordecai even kind of gave away her secret. Second, God is going to deliver from wherever he is going to deliver. God's got infinite ways of delivering his people, but she may not be. And third, maybe you were put in this position for just a time as this. So I think that last one was that crossroad moment where Esther begins to go from her life being taken to standing up and taking control of her life, right? Because the very next verse that says that she sent a reply to Mordecai, verse 16, go and gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days and nights, and I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it's against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Do you see the character change? She goes from somebody who has felt like her life has been taken to somebody who's taking control. She's the one giving instructions. She's the one telling Mordecai to go. She's the one who is putting her life in jeopardy. If she perishes, she perishes. That's chapter 4 of Esther. And I think it's a beautiful story of a woman who comes to a crossroads in life, a defining moment, and makes a choice that reshapes who she is and how she's going to live. It's a defining moment. I have 3 points about these defining moments. My first point is that Esther found herself at a crucial crossroads. Esther finds herself at a crucial crossroads. Just like the defining moments we talked about, right? Like for Kathy, it was that moment Ken told her that Jesus had brothers and sisters. That was a big moment for her. It reshaped her life, right? For a lot of us, it was the moment of sobriety. Well, not for some of us, moment of sobriety. There's so many different defining moments that people have. For Esther, it was this. She comes to a crucial crossroads where she's got to make a decision, right? And I think one thing that's important to remember is that in the 3 chapters that we've gone through so far, Esther has been passive, right? She's been very passive in how she's gone about her life, right? Chapter 2 is where we met Esther, and what we find out about her is that she had lost her parents. Her mother and father had died. They were taken from her. She didn't have any choice in that. That was a defining moment that she just had to deal with. She was taken in by her cousin Mordecai. She didn't have any choice. It was a passive defining moment. It was shaping it, but she just went with the flow or with the current of where her life was taking her. She was taken into the harem of the king, right, with all the other beautiful young virgins. Again, she's just going with the flow, with the current. Her life is being taken. Then again, she's taken to the king, and he sees her, he's pleased with her, and he puts a crown on her head. And she accepts it, right? She's just passive in all of these defining moments. If she's come to a critical crossroads, she's just letting the current decide which direction she should go. At least up to this point. And even at the beginning of the chapter, she still seems to be a little bit passive, right? Like, she lives inside of the citadel of Susa. She's the wife of the king, and yet she had no idea about this edict until somebody went to the gate and started weeping and crying and wailing, right? That's when she found out. You have to wonder, why didn't she know prior to that? Had she just become comfortable in her life inside the citadel? She also hadn't seen her husband for 30 days. Did she just accept that? Was it a vacation? Like, she seems to be just allowing life to pass her by. And she's unsure that the direction that Mordecai wants her to go is going to be safe at all, right? See, when we come to these crucial crossroads in life, there's the path that God wants us to go down. Maybe it's narrow and it's not always easy, right? And then there's the path maybe it's the path of least resistance, right? And on this path, there's all these signs that say, it won't work. You can't do it. Maybe you're not good enough, right? See, that's what comes in Esther's mind as she considers the crossroads that she's at. She knows that Mordecai is asking her to act, but instead of saying, well, maybe this is where I should be, she says, all the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man and woman who approaches the king in the inner courts without being summoned, the king has but one law, that he be put to death unless he extends his golden scepter. See, she is looking for all the reasons why she should just not do what God is asking her to do. And then she says, it's been 30 days. He probably doesn't even want to see me and wouldn't care what I'm coming to before him to do anyway. See, when we come to the crossroads, you've got God's path. Not always, sometimes it's constricting, sometimes it's hard, it's dangerous at times. Of course, Jesus also says that his yoke is easy, right? But the path of least resistance is always saying, do the easy thing. You're not good enough. Esther's not alone. Some of the Bible greats have come to this crossroads and tried to make every excuse on why they should not go the path God would want them to go, right? I just think of Moses. He's palling around the desert. He's out there tending his sheep. That's the easy life. It's very passive. You just go where the sheep want to go. You lead them to water. What a great life. And then he sees this bush that burns but doesn't burn up. And he goes, I got to go see what that's all about. And when he does that, he encounters God at the bush. And God tells him he wants him to go back to Egypt and speak to the Pharaoh and tell him to let his people go. And Moses has so many excuses. Who am I that they would listen to me? What if I don't know? What if they ask who sent me? Well, I don't even know your name. I can't even speak, right? I'm slow to speak, is what Moses says. See, he comes to that crossroads at the burning bush, and God is calling him in one certain direction, but he's looking at the path of least resistance, and he says, I'm not good enough to go on God's path. I don't speak well enough. I'm not powerful enough. They won't listen to me. Come up with all the excuses not to do what God might be calling you to do. I want to read from Jeremiah, another person who had the same kind of response when God called him. Jeremiah 1:6, he says, alas, sovereign Lord. Something I always want to say to God is alas. I'm not sure why. Alas, sovereign Lord. Alas, sovereign Lord, I said, I don't know how to speak. I am too young. Right? See, that's when you come to this critical crossroads, you come up with all the reasons that you shouldn't do the thing that God might be calling you to do. Who's ever come to a crossroad like that? Yeah, it's so easy to find the excuses, isn't it? It's so easy to try to weasel your way out of it. I think what Mordecai tells Esther is really important here. He tells Esther that even if she doesn't act, God's got a way to make it work, right? Let's read what he says to her. He says in verse 14, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Even if Esther refuses to act, God's still going to take care of his people, right? And for the most part, he relies on people. That's something you should remember, because God might be calling you to act. You might be at a crossroads and you might be being called to act. God uses people to accomplish his purpose, but not only people, right? There are also floods, plagues, donkeys. That wasn't on my list, but yes, if God can speak through a donkey, he can definitely speak through me. And then he pulls water from a rock. See, God can act on behalf of his people regardless if people choose to be faithful, but God chooses people for service. Now, notice I'm saying service, not salvation. God chooses people for service. And if you refuse to act, God's got a backup plan. He's probably got infinite numbers of backup plans. And when people don't want to act, he'll pull water from a rock. If the people don't want to cry out, the stones themselves are going to. But God might be calling you to do something, right? And you could come up with excuses. I'm too young. I don't speak well enough. Why would they listen to me? Maybe my husband doesn't want to see me. It's been 30 days. You can come up with all the excuses you want, but obedience promises blessing. Disobedience promises struggles, a curse, if you want to use Deuteronomy language, a curse. So she's at this crucial crossroad, and she has to decide what to do. Of course, we all know what Esther decides to do, right? That brings me to my second point. Esther chooses to follow God's path. Esther chooses to follow God's path. And you can find this moment, right? You can find this moment. It doesn't say it in the text, but you can find this moment. I think the one thing that led her to consider this is when Mordecai says, and who knows, but you could have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go gather together all the Jews. See, she goes from being told what to do to kind of taking responsibility for the situation. Strength instead of passiveness. Is that a word, passiveness? Strength, courage, right? It's a complete character change. Throughout all of Esther's description so far, she's passive. But here, she becomes strong. She becomes bold. She becomes the hero of the story because she's willing to stand up, right? I think, I was thinking through why that statement would have made such a big difference to Esther. And I think it has to do with just the way that her life has turned out. Sometimes we look back at our life and we wonder, like, what are all the decisions that got us here, right? What is it that put us in this moment? I think Esther may have felt like that. See, she had spent her life considering, God, why did you take my parents? Why am I an orphan? Is this didn't you have a better plan for my life than this? When she's pulled from Mordecai's house into the king's palace, for a year she's going through beauty treatments so that she can spend one night that she didn't get to choose anyway. It was chose for her. I think she spent her life wondering, why, God, did you allow this to happen to me? When she's alone in the citadel of Susa and her husband hasn't seen her for 30 days and he doesn't seem to care about her, I'm wondering if she thought the same thing. Why am I in this moment? Why is this happening to me? And when Mordecai says that to her, she realizes that all the unfortunate events that have happened in her life have led her to just this point where she can make a difference. See, I don't think God causes all things, right? But I think God works all things for good for those who love him and are called according to his promise, right? Like, the king was an unwise king. He acted unwise. God used that circumstance to bring about his purpose. And Esther can finally put the puzzle pieces of her life together to give her a sense of, this is what why my life turned out like this. God chooses certain people for service. And she can look back and her life now has meaning. See, I think of my life, right? By the way, a verse real quick of another story that kind of has a similar thought is the story of Joseph. And Joseph is taken away to Egypt, and he probably spent some time wondering, why, God, did this happen to me? But at the end of his life, when he's talking to his brothers and everything's been brought into the surface and they know who he is, he says this, Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, he says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Like, he can look back at his life, all the things that happened to Joseph. I mean, he was abandoned by his brothers. They sold him to slavery. He was working for somebody who accused him of raping them, and then he's put in prison, and then he serves the king, and he's looking back at all the unfortunate life-changing moments, and he can finally sit back and look at his life and say, all the things that you intended to harm me, God used it for his good. Esther can now look back and say, all the things that happened to me, the why, it's been used for good, to bring me to this very moment. I think when I was thinking through the crossroads, the life-defining moment, of course, marrying January was a life-defining moment. We were way too young, but we did it anyway, and it shaped the trajectory of my life. I wouldn't take it back. Having kids, a silly life-defining moment was just getting my dog. He shaped how I can do everything during the day. I have to constantly be thinking about how this might affect my dog, right? We can't even go on vacation on the 4th of July because maybe he might be afraid. Way off topic, I guess. But life-defining moments are those moments that change your life. And I can think of none other than when I gave my life to Christ. When I pledged my life to him. See, it changed how I should live my life. Because now I see that he is king and I'm the subject. Look at how Paul describes this in Colossians chapter 3. He's basically saying that decision you had to follow Christ should shape your entire identity. Colossians chapter 3, since then you have been raised with Christ. See, you've been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Your heart is what's center to you, right? It's the center. It describes the whole will of a person. That's supposed to be on things above now, not on earthly things. He says, set your minds, your intellect, on things above, not on earthly things. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. I think the most fundamental defining moment, starts with the question is there a God? But when you give your life to Christ, it should shape the trajectory of it completely, right? My third point is Esther could not walk alone. She needed community, right? Esther could not walk alone. She needed community. She comes to this moment in life where she chooses for herself, for the first time really, that she chooses that she's going to be proactive. She's going to be the one that sends out the order. And she tells Mordecai, she says this, she says, "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me." The idea of fasting is an allusion to God. This is an allusion to prayer, right? You don't fast without praying, right? Maybe if you want to use a word for this, it's synecdoche, right? You go take a bite to eat. Well, you're not really just eating one bite, you're eating a whole sandwich. You don't just fast, you fast and pray, right? That's just, they go together. The command to fast implies prayer. Anyway, she says, "Fast for me. And now I and my attendants will fast also. And when this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." What she realized is that God was calling her to do something, but she could not do it alone. She needed a community of people behind her. To be openly fasting and praying on her behalf, right? There's a verse in Joel I want to read, and then I'll be done because I'm out of time, that I think kind of shows, what God is looking for and also the kind of community that Esther needs. In Joel chapter 2, verse 16 and 17, it says this, "Gather the people Consecrate the assembly. Bring together the elders. Gather the children, those nursing at the breast. See, there's no excuses not to show up. Let the bridegroom leave his room and the bride her chamber. Like, that didn't even happen during times of war. But God is saying to Joel, call the whole assembly together, right? Let the priests who minister before the Lord weep between the portico and the altar. Let them say, spare us, Lord. Do not make your inheritance an object of scorn, a byword among the nations. That's what Esther is calling them to do, to repent, to fast, to go to God and seek his intervention to stop the destruction that's coming. There's a command also in Joel, verse 12 of chapter 2, where it's a promise, actually. It says, even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate. See, God is a God that's looking for genuine repentance, not just the outward expressions of tearing your garments, but a rending, a tearing of your heart completely. And Esther calls the whole community to do this because she needs community behind her, but so do we. As Christians, we're supposed to spur one another on towards love and good deeds. As we see the day approaching, right, we're supposed to encourage one another. See, when I read this story, I see that Esther comes to a life-defining moment that changes her character in the story. She goes from passive to active, from being taken to taking responsibility for her life, from following the commands of Mordecai to giving commands to Mordecai. And she asks for help from other people, to pray, to encourage, to seek God on her behalf. I don't know what life-defining moment that you might be going through, but I know you can't do it alone. I know that you need community. And this church is one that will strengthen and encourage. Heck, we'll weep for you. You want me to tear my shirt? I will. But we will encourage and push one another towards love and good deeds, because that's what it is to be a Christian. We've come to a moment that reshapes our life. Our identity is now fixed in heaven, and we are part of a community that encourages one another all the more.